Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. At peace, Archbishop Carlo Vigano breaks his silence today. He insists he wrote the 11-page letter calling for Pope Francis's resignation over his handling of the American sex abuse crisis, not out of revenge or anger, but out of love for the Catholic Church. It comes as Pope Francis addressed the global sex abuse crisis. During his weekly talk in St. Peter's Square, the Holy Father did not mention the turmoil in the American church. Instead, he expressed regret for the way church leaders in Ireland failed to respond.
Ho chiesto perdono al Signore per questi peccati.
The address follows the accusations by Archbishop Carlo Vigano this weekend that the Pope covered up the American cardinal's misdeeds. Pope Francis begged for forgiveness for the abuse pedophile priests perpetrated in Ireland and says he asked the Lord for forgiveness for these sins, for the scandal, and the sense of betrayal it caused. Edward Pentin, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us. Ed, the Pope mentioned victims today. Many of them feel they have been forgotten and that church leaders are fighting and pointing fingers. Is there a sense that the Vatican has lost sight of those people who were hurt the most?
Well, there is a concern there, Lauren, in the sense that obviously you've got like two parents quarreling and that the children often get pushed aside. And I think there's a sense that that is happening here. But on the other hand, I think people think, well, if this brings better processes and better ways of dealing with abuse and helping those victims, then maybe in the long run it'll all be for the good. So I think maybe this is just a time that they think they've got to go through in order to get to that point.
So let's talk about where it all began with critics of Archbishop Vigano. And with the letter that he wrote, that's where it began. The critics are the ones calling into questions inconsistencies and gaps in his testimony, calling for Pope Francis's resignation, including something from Minnesota. Tell us about those gaps and what are the criticisms?
Okay, well, there's some gaps in this testimony. I think people criticize it for being perhaps a little too emotional. There isn't a lot of information there backing it up. There's no documentation, at least, put in with the testimony. Although Archbishop Vigano is known to be a man of integrity and is somebody who's very respected, this testimony does have certain weaknesses to it, they say, and that's some of them. But also, I think in terms of Archbishop Vigano's history, this case in Minnesota, he's issued a statement saying that there is no proof that he obstructed an investigation into abuse, that he didn't cover it up. But we haven't actually got on the record statements corroborating that from Minnesota yet.
So there is no clear answer on that. There's also no clear direction coming from the Vatican about how it is going to deal with the crisis. What are you hearing?
Well, that isn't clear either, and it's obviously still early days, and they're still trying to decide what they can do. Although, of course, they've had many years in which to really try to decide how to deal with the crisis. But I think one aspect which I think people are concerned about is on Cardinal McCarrick and how he was allowed, despite sanctions imposed on him by Benedict, to continue to live a public life, having been told that he couldn't. And I think questions are going to be asked, well, why did that happen, and why were these sanctions not properly enforced?
Right, that's by both popes. If the restrictions were brought by Benedict the 16th, why weren't they enforced by either of those popes? Edward Pentin, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Lauren.